How important is this tariff situation that we find ourselves in? Because we're seeing it all over the news everywhere. Tariffs, Trump's done this, 10% here, blanket tariff here. Does it matter? And maybe even more specifically, does it matter to the average person?
It has the potential to be the biggest economic story of our lives. It doesn't have to be. One thing that's very interesting about the tariff story is that if you compare it to 9/11 or COVID or 2008, the banking crisis, the tariff issue that we're going through right now can be ended in 1 minute. There's a button on the president's desk that says end it right now. And even if that did happen, there would still be some lingering damage in terms of trust and reputation. But there was no button on the president's desk for COVID that said end this all right now. It didn't exist. And 9/11 and Lehman Brothers in 2008, once those risks hit, we just had to deal with them through their finish. This is different because it can and is changing by the day. So when people have a take on what's going on right now, that take might be stale an hour from now. But it's absolutely true that the global economy, to an extent that I think people don't appreciate enough, is a very complicated, intricate machine. And most economic problems come when people like try to fiddle with that machine a little bit. They're like, oh, let's turn this dial by 1 degree and see what happens. And then like, oh, it blows up. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. Tariffs is like, let's hit it with a baseball bat a couple times. Let's hit it with like a crowbar and see what happens. Like the global economy is so interconnected. And if you go to your local grocery store, Target or Walmart, whatever it might be, and go around and look at where that stuff was made. I mean, and it's all over the world. It's like it's everywhere. And once you shut that down and put barriers on that, it can become a big problem very quickly. One thing I've noticed in the last couple of weeks that I think is very interesting are the number of educated and smart friends that I have who send me a text or a call or an email and say, hey, can you explain what a tariff is? I see this word, but I don't really know what it is. And I think that's important because I don't think the average person understands what can happen to the economy if this persists for a long period of time.
I'm so glad you said that because I've been waiting for weeks now to ask somebody like yourself who studied economics to explain in a simple way what a tariff is. And feel free to use an analogy. I think about 50% of people have no idea what a tariff is.
Yeah.
And then on a sort of an incremental scale, people's clarity gets better and better. I would estimate about 5% of the general population could articulate what a tariff is, 5% or less. So can you tell me what a tariff is?
The first I would say is tariffs have been used for hundreds of years. And there can be a very good, useful purpose for them in the economy. I think as they're structured right now in the United States, it's a huge mistake. It has a potential to be a catastrophe. But they can be a useful thing in the economy. This is not a black and white thing. What a tariff is keep this very simple. The United States buys a bunch of computers that are made in China, a bunch of iPhones that are made in China. They're on a container ship. They ship them to the United States. When they get to the port in the United States, the importer, which is Apple, bringing the iPhones in that are made in China,
An American company.
has to pay the tariff
Oh,
that's put on it. And a lot of people, and it's very understandable why they would think this, would say, well, no, in that situation, China pays the tariff. And there could be a situation where China starts discounting the iPhones. The company that's making the iPhones would discount it. Like there can be some offset. But the person who's paying that tax is the importer.
So often we think about we've applied the tariff to China.
Right.
So what's happening is China having to spend the 10%, or I think the tariff currently is like 125,
145. The
145%.
number doesn't matter because trade will just stop at those levels. It just won't happen.
So if Apple import an iPhone now with that tariff level, then Apple would have to pay the 145% when it arrives at the shore
Correct.
of the United
I mean,
States.
here's an example that most people will understand. Sales tax. You know, in most states in the United States, it's 6 to 10%. If you go to the store and buy something, you add the sales tax to that.
VAT in the UK.
Oh, yeah, fair. Who pays that is not the store, it's the customer. So even if the tax is put on the seller passes it on to you, the customer, and it says right on your receipt, you bought something for $10, and then there's your sales tax, and here's what you're going to pay in the end. And so it's similar from that. Now, let me explain this, why there would be a very useful case for tariffs to show that this is not black and white, and this is not, oh, all tariffs are bad. This happened in the United States during COVID. We were virtually 100% reliant on masks, N95 masks that were made in China and Korea and not in the United States. And so when you have a medical crisis in the early days of COVID, and we're like, we need hundreds of millions of masks yesterday, they're all made somewhere else. We do not want to be in that situation. So it would absolutely make sense to have a tariff on masks to make sure that they are so expensive to import overseas that we have to start making them in the United States. That makes sense. Same with military equipment. You do not want to go to war with a country and be reliant on that country to make your military gear, your bullets and your bombs and your tanks and whatnot. Absolutely makes sense to have a tariff on that to make sure they're made in the United States. That said, so it's not black and white, but to have a blanket tariff and say everything that comes from any country, anywhere in the world, and China's going to be this to an extreme degree, is going to have a tariff on it. And whether that's between 10% for all countries or 145% from China, that, I've used this analogy before that if you talk to dietitians, there is a huge amount of debate over what's the best diet should you eat. Should you be keto? Should you be vegan? Like everything in between. There's so much debate. All of them agree that processed sugar is bad. Nobody thinks processed sugar is good. And tariffs are that with economists. Like there is so much debate among economists on what should the tax rate be? What should subsidies be? Should we, like free market versus subsidies? There's so much debate. No serious economist thinks that you should have a trade war. And the thing is, this is not new. We've been doing this for hundreds of years. And it's very well known that in the 1930s, the Great Depression, we put huge tariffs on in the early days of the Great Depression. They didn't know it was called the Great Depression back then because we put them on and it shut down global trade. And it's easy to think that if you put tariffs on your own country, that will make it easier to manufacture. Like all those jobs that we shipped overseas of building cars, they're all going to come rushing back to America. And it very rarely happens like that when you have a trade war. But what I mean by trade war is we put tariffs on China, they respond to put tariffs on us, and you just go tit for tat, and you go back and forth, and it's like mutually assured destruction in economic terms.
So why is Trump doing it then, in your view? Because he's given lots of reasons. He said that they're ripping us off. He says lots of countries have been ripping off the United States. How do you unpack what he's saying there, and what do you believe the true reason is underneath there?
To his credit, Trump has been very consistent on this for literally 40 years. You can go on YouTube. He gave an interview in, I think it was 1986. He went on Oprah in 1986 talking about how free trade wasn't free and that Japan and other countries were ripping us off and that the solution to it were tariffs. So this is not a new view. This has been a lifelong quest that he's had. I would say not necessarily Trump's views, but I would say it absolutely makes sense that there is a large chunk of America that looks back to the period of 1950s, 1960s, when we were a manufacturing powerhouse and says, that was better than what we have now, and we should go back to that. I get why people would say that, because it's true that we've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs in the last 50 years. I think manufacturing jobs peaked in the late 1970s, and we've lost something like 10 million manufacturing jobs that we had, versus what we had back then. Mm-hmm. And I get why, if I was in that situation, I would probably feel the same. Where I would push back is the situation that we had in the 1950s and 1960s, where it was just America manufacturing powerhouse, were a very unique period that I think is virtually impossible to bring back. And I'll tell you why. At the end of World War II, 1945, Europe and Japan were in rubble. They were decimated from the war. America was not decimated whatsoever. And so we had basically a global manufacturing monopoly for a period of time. China was not in the equation. South Korea was not in the equation. India, Bangladesh, they were not in the equation. It was basically Japan, the United States, and Europe, two of which were just struggling to feed their citizens. And once they got that under control, it was like we have to rebuild the damage from the war. So America had about 20 years from 1945 to the mid-1960s of we have a manufacturing monopoly. And then we had 16 million US soldiers come home from the war. And there was so much pent-up demand for them to buy homes and washing machines and cars and radios and all these things. And all of them were built in America because nobody else could build them. And that created a really special time when, because we had a manufacturing monopoly, it was just like factories everywhere. We built up so many factories during the war. There was endless demand for those products. And this is an important part too. White-collar workers during that period didn't make that much money relative to what they did before or since. And that was important because the wages that the blue-collar manufacturing workers were earning felt great by comparison. So if you were an auto worker in Detroit and you compared your wage in 1955 to the local accountant or dentist or doctor, by comparison, relative to today, you're like, oh, it's pretty good. Yeah, the doctor makes more than me, but not that much more than me. You know, I drive a Chevy, he drives a Cadillac. His is a little bit nicer, but we're living mostly the same lives. And so I think that was a lot of the feeling of prosperity in the 50s and 60s was this very unique period of manufacturing monopoly as Europe and Japan were rebuilding. And by comparison to other workers, it felt amazing. And then at about the 1970s, Japan and Europe had gotten themselves back together from the ravages of World War II, and they became manufacturing dynamos in their own right. And I don't think we really understood this in America until three companies came in, which were Toyota, Honda, and Nissan. And they started selling cars in America. And at first, it was very easy to be like, look at these little like lawnmower toys that they're importing. Because you compared like an early Honda Civic to like a Chevy Camaro in the 70s. And it was like, you can't even compare them. So at first, the reaction of American car companies were like, these guys are a joke. No one's going to buy these little cars. But then gas prices surged in the 70s and 80s. And all of a sudden, the cars that Americans wanted was the tiny little Honda Civic that got really good gas mileage. And then once they started buying them, they're like, hey, this Toyota, this Honda, this Nissan, it's actually a pretty good car. It's actually pretty well built. And I think there was a lot of denial among American manufacturers that these other nations that didn't exist for 20 years in terms of a global manufacturing source were actually pretty damn good at it now. Mm. And then one other thing happened to wrap this up, then this might be the most important part of it. The reason that you cannot reasonably expect the manufacturing powerhouse to come back as it was is, yes, we did ship jobs to China and Mexico and Canada and India that used to be in America. And that has contributed to the massive decline in manufacturing employment. But a bigger factor in there is automation. And if you look at I would challenge people to do this. Go on YouTube and look at a Tesla assembly line in the United States.
I'll put it on the screen.
It is what you will see. It's amazing. It is a miracle of engineering. What you will see are armies and armies of robots and very few people. And if you compare that to the 1950s assembly line, what you see are biceps and backs and people hauling around material. So because we got so good at automation, even if we bring manufacturing back to America, and that we still do a lot of manufacturing in America, it doesn't require the amount of employment that it used to. It doesn't require the amount of manpower. And the people who do work on Tesla manufacturing lines, by and large, are working on computers overseeing the robots. I mean, here's one stat that I thought was always interesting to me. In 1950, there was a US steel plant in Gary, Indiana. It produced 5 million tons of steel and had 30,000 workers. Today, it's still operating. It produces 8 million tons of steel and has 2,000 workers. So it's producing more steel today than it was in the 1950s. And they went from 30,000 workers to 2,000. Because what used to be done with biceps and backs and shoulders is now done with machines and robots. And it's no different than what happened in agriculture, where a farm 200 years ago was rakes and shovels, and today it's tractors and combines. Like that same thing happened to assembly. So to wrap all that up, like I understand and I empathize with people who say we need to bring back manufacturing to America. We lost what we once had. I get that and I respect it. But I think the unique circumstances and automation makes it just extremely unlikely to ever happen.
How did China get in there? And why are they the factory of the world? What are the core components that went into them being able to produce all of the things that we use on a daily basis at a fraction of the price that they're able to produce them here?
Tim Cook of Apple gave a really interesting interview a couple weeks ago. And he said, you might think that we manufacture iPhones in China because it's cheap labor. And he said, that's not really true anymore. It used to be, but China is not the cheap labor country anymore. That's moved on to Bangladesh and Cambodia and other places. The reason they manufacture in China is expertise. And I think it's okay to admit, and people should admit, that your country and also your company and you individually can be very good at some things and not very good at others. China is just extremely good and extremely talented at particularly like low-end manufacturing. Low-end can be anything from, inflatable swimming pools on up to like basic electronics. They're extremely good at it. I was talking to a CEO a couple weeks ago, and he said, and he's generalizing here, but he said, if you go to a Chinese factory and you say, I want this part made, and here's step 1, step 2, step 3 on how to make it, they will do it better than anybody in the world. Nobody can beat them at that. But if you go to that same factory and you say, please go design me a new part, They're not very good at it. Americans are way better at that. And that's why the back of your iPhone says designed in California, made in China. Like it's just specialization of labor. And I think America is the best in the world at a couple things: entrepreneurship, technology, services, and like high-end manufacturing, like planes and rockets. And we're not the best in the world at low-end manufacturing. And that's okay. That's not an insult. That's not a put down. There's specialization of labor. And so I think China just got very good at one thing during a time when we've always been very, very good at different things. And I think that is why global is like why for a lot of people, not for everybody. So if you disagree with this, I get it. By why the economic system works so damn well over the last 30 years is because we really got good at specialization of labor. You design the iPhone, you make the iPhone, we're both better off for it.
I want to play that clip you're talking about with Tim Cook because I remember seeing it as well. And it was a bit of an aha moment for me. For anybody that doesn't know, Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple, and he's been at the helm of Apple for more than a decade. And as you know, most of Apple's products, from what I understand, are made in China.
There's a confusion about China that, and let me at least give you my opinion. The popular conception is that companies come to China because of low labor cost. I'm not sure what part of China they go to, but the truth is China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago. And that is not the reason to come to China from a supply point of view. The reason is because of the skill and the quantity of skill in one location and the type of skill it is. Like the products we do require really advanced tooling. And the precision that you have to have in tooling and working with the materials that we do are state of the art. And the tooling skill is very deep here. You know, in the US, you could have a meeting of tooling engineers, and I'm not sure we could fill the room. In China, you could fill multiple.
I think when I watch that, I think that I can understand why there'd be a natural reaction for people to be like, no, if they can do it, we can do it too. And again, I don't think it's an insult to say like countries are, it's like, we're really good at some things and less good at others. How could that not be true?
Are they on a different living wage? From what I understand, is that
Oh yes,
the
absolutely.
equation?
I mean, so much of it is, if you asked Americans to work for those wages, they would absolutely refuse to do it just because of the expectations we have. And that's a good thing. We should be proud of that we have a standard of living which does not allow or people would not put up with earning $5 a day or whatever it would be.
Which means that the products can be made cheaper.
Yes.
Significantly cheaper.
Right. And this is where I understand why people might raise an eyebrow at this, but so much of what the modern system, how it's supposed to work, is when you have that specialization, products become cheaper. And then the iPhone costs $1,000, when in any other world, it would cost $4,000 if we're building it in the United States at, paying wages that people would put up with in the United States.
So what's the impact on the average person listening to this now? And if this trade war continues, if these tariffs continue, what is the impact they're going to see in their life?
It's so unpredictable because, as I said earlier, it can literally change an hour from now. So anyone giving firm predictions of, oh, here's what's going to happen next, that's not how any of this works. But you can say, though, that if the tariffs last, one of two things will happen, or both of these two things will happen. Things that we import will get much more expensive, or what's more likely in places like China, if it's 145%, is the trade just stops. And then you're probably a matter of weeks away from empty shelves for certain products in certain cases. I mean, if you're buying, a pair of slippers from China for $1 and now all of a sudden they're $2.45. If you're an importer, for a lot of those situations, they'll say like, it's just not going to work. Or if the iPhone that used to cost $1,000 is now going to cost $2,500, Apple might just say, there's not really a market for that. We can't really sell those. Let's just pause and wait for things to happen. We're already seeing that. I'm sure this news will change by the time this airs. This is moving so quickly, but our shipping container imports from China have plunged in recent weeks, which is exactly what you would expect when you put that high of a tax on it. I mean, if you were buying a house for $1 million and all of a sudden they put on 145% tax on that, you're probably not going to buy the house. And that's what's happening now.
You'd be dumb not to wait.
Right.
I was sat here yesterday with the CEO, and she said to me that she gets the majority of her products, pretty much all of them, from China. And when she's looking at the tariff situation, she's figured out that if she buys those products and sells them at her current price, she's losing money on every unit.
Yeah.
So she's like, I'll lose $9 on importing a for example, like a dress, it's like I have no incentive now to continue to sell that dress. And if my only choice is to raise the price by like 150% to my customer.
Right. The two likely outcomes, if it persists, are much higher prices and empty shelves. And I don't think anyone knows when or to the extent that could happen. And the button on the desk that says end this all could be pressed before that happens. But if it persists, that's what's likely to occur.
What about the impact it has on trust in the United States? Because
yeah, it's huge. I mean,
can you explain that to me?
Trust is hard because you don't know how valuable it is until you lose it. But once you lose it, you're like, oh, that was everything. And foreign investors, people who don't live in the United States, have $30 trillion invested in America. That's just in stocks and bonds. That's not housing or office buildings, just in stocks and bonds, $30 trillion that they've invested. And a lot of the reason they do that, well, there's many reasons. One of which is because it's by and large seen as a trustworthy economy, a stable economy, an economy of rules and predictable laws and trust that you could not say the same about Russia. And so when global investors are looking where to park their money, this has been the case for the last 80 years. America is usually at the top of that list. There's also a thing where a lot of the reason that they invest money in the United States is because they have to, because they have a trade deficit with us. So if China is selling us a lot more stuff than they're buying from us, like we're importing a lot more from China than we're exporting back to them, they're going to end up with a lot of US dollars. And what they need to do something with those dollars. They have to invest them somewhere. And historically, that's been in treasury bonds, which lowered our interest rates, and that was good for everybody.
And what's a treasury bond?
It's debt that the government issues from the federal government. So it's a bond. You're loaning money to the government, and they're promising to repay you plus interest.
Okay. So less people are going to do that if they have less trust in the United States.
Less trust, and also less need to do it because they don't have as many dollars that they need to invest.
Are we heading for a recession? Because I saw some stats earlier on that said the probability of a recession has surged by 45%, which is the highest since December 2023 because of the tariffs. That was from Reuters.
It's interesting when people point like the odds of recession at 45% because they can't be wrong. Like if there isn't a recession, they'd be like, yeah, we said it was 45%. We didn't say it was going to happen. So my answer, if you said, are we heading for a recession, would always be yes. If you asked me a year ago, if you asked me 5 years ago, like historically, there's a recession. In modern times, it's been every 4 to 5 years that it's occurred. And so we shouldn't pretend that when they happen, that they're this crazy out of the blue thing. It's an inevitable feature that you're always going to have recessions. But is this going to cause it?
What is a recession?
A recession technically is when GDP in the economy, GDP is just like economic output, how much the economy is moving. When that declines for 2 quarters in a row, that's the technical definition. For most people, you don't need to worry about technical definitions because a recession in your mind is when you are feeling worse off economically for a long period of time. When you feel like you can't get a job or your neighbors, your roommates can't get jobs and it's starting to hurt on you. It's kind of like, what's the definition of being sick? Well, it's when you don't feel good, but you can get more technical than that. But a recession for most people is when you don't